The warehouse smelled of rust and desperation, a metallic tang that clung to the back of Agent Maya Chen's throat as she crouched behind a shipping container, her service weapon drawn. Through the grimy windows, shafts of amber streetlight cut through the darkness like prison bars, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. Her earpiece crackled with static before Detective Rodriguez's voice came through, tense and urgent. "Chen, we've got movement on the north side. 3 vehicles just pulled up. Black SUVs, tinted windows." Maya pressed her back against the cold metal container, feeling the familiar weight of her badge against her chest, a shield she'd earned through 15 years of hunting the shadows that had once consumed her own childhood. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was back in a place that looked exactly like where her nightmare had begun 25 years ago. Except now, she held the power. Now she carried the authority to end what had been done to countless others. "Copy that, Rodriguez. Hold your position until we get the signal from Agent Thompson inside." Maya's voice was steady, professional, betraying nothing of the storm that raged beneath her composed exterior. But her free hand unconsciously touched the small silver locket at her throat, a talisman she'd carried since she was 8 years old, the only thing they'd let her keep when everything else was stripped away. The locket had been her mother's once, before addiction and desperation had turned love into currency, before promises of a better life for her daughter had become the lie that sold Maya into hell. Inside the locket was a photo so faded that the faces were barely visible, but Maya knew every line by heart. Her parents, young and hopeful, holding their baby daughter on a summer day when the world still made sense. "Agent Chen?" Rodriguez's voice cut through her reverie. "You still with us?" "Always." Though part of her was still that 8-year-old girl, being led away from the only home she'd ever known, her small hand clutching a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons, while her mother counted crumpled bills with shaking fingers. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The way her father had turned away, unable to meet her eyes, the hollow sound of the door closing behind her, the car engine starting as her childhood ended. Maya shook her head, forcing herself back to the present. Tonight was about justice, about breaking the chain that had started with her own betrayal. Through months of undercover work, she'd traced the operation back to its source, a network that had been stealing childhoods for decades, the same network that had purchased her from parents who chose drugs over their daughter's safety. The warehouse around her told its own story of broken dreams. Graffiti covered the walls in layers, each tag a desperate attempt to claim identity in a place designed to strip it away. Empty shipping containers stood like hollow monuments to human cargo, their doors hanging open like mouths screaming silent accusations. The concrete floor was stained with substances Maya preferred not to identify, and in the corners she could see the remnants of makeshift living spaces, dirty mattresses, empty food containers, children's toys abandoned in the chaos of raids and relocations. "Movement confirmed," Agent Thompson's voice whispered through the earpiece. "I count at least 12 individuals inside. Mix of adults and minors. The kingpin just arrived. It's definitely Marcus Volkov." Maya's pulse quickened. Volkov, the name that had haunted her dreams for years. The man whose organization had tentacles reaching back to every trafficking ring on the East Coast, including the one that had claimed her. She'd spent 3 years building this case, 3 years of sleeping 2 hours a night and chasing leads through the underbelly of organized crime, 3 years of looking into the faces of rescued children and seeing herself staring back. Her partner, Sarah Kim, materialized beside her like a shadow, her own weapon ready. Sarah was 10 years younger, all sharp angles and burning righteousness, the kind of cop who believed justice was a sword to be wielded rather than a balance to be maintained. They'd been working together for 6 months now, ever since Maya had specifically requested her for this operation.
"You ready for this?" Sarah whispered, her dark eyes reflecting the amber streetlight. She'd grown up in foster care herself, bounced from home to home until she'd aged out of the system with nothing but determination and a badge number she'd dreamed of since she was 15. Maya nodded, though ready felt like too simple a word for what she felt. She was terrified and exhilarated, haunted and empowered, broken and whole all at the same time. She was an 8-year-old girl being sold by her parents, and she was a 33-year-old federal agent about to bring down an empire. She was every contradiction that survival could create. "Chen, this is command," came another voice through the earpiece. Deputy Director Wallace, running the operation from the mobile command unit, parked 3 blocks away. "We've confirmed 17 federal warrants are present inside that building. This is your show, Agent. You've earned the right to call the shots." 17 warrants. 17 people who had traded in human misery, who had looked at children and seen dollar signs instead of souls. Maya thought of the files she'd memorized, the faces of the missing, the statistics that never captured the full scope of the damage. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, over 50,000 cases had been reported in the past 5 years alone, but experts estimated that represented only a fraction of the actual victims. The warehouse creaked around them, settling into the night like an old man's bones. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle wailed, a sound that took Maya back to the countless nights she'd lain on a thin mattress in a locked room, listening to trains and wondering if she'd ever be free to ride one. The sound had become her lullaby and her prayer, a promise that somewhere beyond the walls, there was still a world where people chose love over money. "Sarah," Maya whispered, turning to her partner, "when we go in there, remember, some of those kids have never known safety. They're going to be more afraid of us than of their captors. We move slow, we speak soft, and we show them our badges first. Our weapons, never." Sarah nodded, her jaw tight with concentration. "What about Volkov?" Maya's hand tightened on her weapon. "Volkov is mine." The words came out harder than she had tended, carrying 25 years of rage and pain and determination. She'd read his file so many times she could recite it from memory. Marcus Volkov, 54 years old, originally from Moldova, had been running trafficking operations since the 1990s. He specialized in what the FBI called domestic procurement, buying children from desperate families within the United States, then moving them through a network of safe houses and front businesses. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. He was, quite possibly, the man who orchestrated her own sale. The radio crackled again. "All units, this is Thompson. They're starting to move the children. I repeat, they're starting to move the children. We need to go now." Maya's training kicked in, overriding the emotional storm. She signaled to Sarah, then spoke into her radio. "All units, this is Agent Chen. We are go for Operation Homecoming. Remember, children are priority 1. I want every adult in custody and every minor safe within the next 10 minutes. She rose from behind the container, her weapon trained on the warehouse's main entrance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire adult life, the convergence of her deepest pain and her greatest purpose. As she moved toward the building, Maya caught sight of her reflection in a broken window, a woman in tactical gear, face painted with shadows and determination, looking nothing like the terrified child she had once been. But in her eyes, if you knew how to look, you could still see the 8-year-old girl who had promised herself that someday, somehow, she would come back for all the others who couldn't save themselves.
The warehouse door stood before her like a portal between past and present, between victim and victor. Behind that door were the answers she'd been seeking for 25 years, and the justice she'd been fighting to deliver for 15. Maya took a deep breath, tasted rust and desperation one more time, and stepped forward into the light. Maya's apartment in downtown Baltimore bore little resemblance to a home and more to a war room disguised as a living space. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and red string connecting faces to locations, to dates, a spiderweb of evidence that had consumed 3 years of her life. Her morning routine began the same way every day. She made coffee, checked the overnight reports from missing children hotlines, and stared at the photo of Marcus Volkov that she'd taped to her bathroom mirror. "Good morning, you bastard," she whispered to the photo. the same greeting she'd offered for 1,247 consecutive days. The ritual had become as automatic as brushing her teeth, a daily reminder of why she woke up, why she put on the badge, and why she voluntarily walked into the darkness that most people spent their lives avoiding. The coffee was always black, always bitter, always consumed while standing at her kitchen window, looking down at the street. From her third-floor apartment, she could see the bus stop where 3 different trafficking routes converged, a piece of intelligence that had taken her 6 months to confirm and that had influenced her choice of address. Even in her off hours, Maya was never truly off-duty. Her life had become a singular focus, a laser beam of purpose that left little room for anything else. Her phone buzzed with a text from her therapist, Dr. Elizabeth Reeves. "Don't forget, appointment at 3 p.m. today. We need to talk about the nightmares." Maya deleted the message without responding, the same way she'd deleted the previous 14 reminder texts. She'd been court-ordered to attend therapy after a particularly violent arrest 6 months ago, when she'd put a suspected trafficker in the hospital for making a comment about fresh merchandise. The department brass had insisted on psychological evaluation, and Dr. Reeves had been assigned to determine whether Maya was fit for duty. The assessment was still ongoing. Maya showered quickly, her movements efficient and purposeful. The hot water couldn't wash away the memories that clung to her skin like smoke, the phantom sensations of chains and locked doors that haunted her even in sleep. She'd learned to function with 4 hours of rest per night, had trained her body to survive on adrenaline and determination when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Her reflection in the shower-fogged mirror showed the physical evidence of her journey, a scar along her left shoulder blade from a knife fight during her 2nd year undercover, a small tattoo on her wrist, the key that she'd gotten on her 21st birthday to remind herself that she now held the power to unlock doors. Her body was lean and strong, conditioned by hours at the gym where she worked out her rage on heavy bags that she pretended bore the faces of everyone who had ever profited from human suffering. The drive to the FBI field office took her through 3 distinct neighborhoods: the gentrified downtown, where young professionals jogged past boutique coffee shops; the working-class district, where families struggled to balance multiple jobs and mortgage payments; and finally, the forgotten corners where desperation made people vulnerable to promises that were too good to be true. Maya knew all 3 worlds intimately. She'd lived in the third, fought to escape to the second, and now worked to protect all of them from the shadows that lurked at the edges. At 7:30 a.m., she was at her desk, reviewing overnight intelligence reports. Her workspace was legendary within the Bureau, a monument to obsession that her colleagues both admired and worried about. File folders were stacked in perfect towers, each labeled with dates and case numbers that only Maya could decipher. Her computer monitors displayed feeds from traffic cameras, social media monitoring software, and encrypted communication channels that she'd spent years learning to navigate. Special Agent in Charge, Morrison, appeared at her cubicle with 2 cups of coffee and the expression he wore when he was about to deliver news she wouldn't want to hear. At 55, Morrison had the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much, but the kind eyes of someone who still believed in redemption. He'd been Maya's mentor since her first day at Quantico, the one person in the Bureau who knew the full details of her background. "Chen," he said, settling into the chair beside her desk, "we need to talk about your leave request." Maya didn't look up from her computer screen. "I'm not taking leave, Morrison, not when we're this close." "You've been saying this close for 3 years. Your last psychological evaluation flagged some concerns about emotional attachment to the case. Dr. Reeves thinks you need a break." "Dr. Reeves thinks I need to process my childhood trauma through interpretive dance and crystal healing," Maya replied, finally meeting his eyes. "What I need is to finish what I started." Morrison sipped his coffee, studying her face with the careful attention of someone trying to read a map in a foreign language. "Tell me about the nightmares, Maya." The question hit her like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. The nightmares had been getting worse, more vivid, more frequent, bleeding into her waking hours until sometimes she wasn't sure whether she was chasing Volkov through the present or still running from him in the past. They're dreams, Morrison. Everyone has dreams. Not everyone dreams about being 8 years old and sold to strangers. Not everyone wakes up screaming their parents' names. His voice was gentle but firm. Your neighbor called the building manager. They're concerned about the noise. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been so careful to maintain her professional composure, to compartmentalize her past and her present, but the walls she'd been building were developing cracks. "I'll handle it." "I know you will. That's not what I'm worried about." Morrison leaned forward. "I'm worried about what happens when you finally catch Volkov. I'm worried about whether you'll arrest him or kill him." The honesty of the question caught Maya off guard. She'd been asking herself the same thing for months, lying awake in the pre-dawn darkness, wondering what she would do when she finally stood face to face with the architect of her childhood hell. The answers scared her, which is why she'd been avoiding Dr. Reeves and her probing questions. "He'll get due process, just like every other criminal." Morrison nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. "Your partner thinks you're carrying too much of this alone. Detective Kim mentioned that you've been working 18-hour days, that you haven't taken a weekend off in 8 months. Maya's jaw tightened. She liked Sarah, respected her dedication and integrity, but she hadn't signed up for a babysitter. Sarah doesn't understand the scope of what we're dealing with. She sees this as another case. For the first time since Maya had entered the room, Volkov's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face more carefully, looking past the federal agent to find traces of the child he had once purchased. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking over a landscape of memory. The Chen girl. You were supposed to be processed through the Miami pipeline. How did you... He stopped himself, perhaps realizing that admitting to specific crimes wasn't in his best interest. "I escaped," he said simply. 3 years later, foster family in Pennsylvania. Took me 15 years to become a federal agent and another 3 to track you down. Volkov actually smiled, a cold, calculating expression that chilled Maya to the bone. "You think this is justice? You think arresting me will undo what was done to you?" Maya felt Sarah's presence behind her, felt the weight of protocol and procedure, and 25 years of careful self-control. But she also felt the 8-year-old girl inside her chest, the one who had never stopped asking why her parents chose drugs over her daughter's safety. "Maybe not," Maya replied, "but it'll keep you from destroying any more families."
"Families?" Volkov laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your parents came to me, Agent Chen. They begged me to take you off their hands. Your mother couldn't even look at you during the transaction. Said you reminded her too much of the life she wanted to forget." The words hit Maya like physical blows, each one aimed at the deepest wounds in her psyche. She'd spent years in therapy learning to process her parents' betrayal, learning to understand addiction as a disease rather than a choice, learning to forgive people who had been too broken to protect their own child. "You're lying," she said, but her voice carried uncertainty. "Am I?" Volkov shifted slightly, testing the limits of Maya's attention. "Your father cried during the negotiation, said he loved you but couldn't choose between his daughter and his next fix. Your mother was already planning how to spend the money before we finished counting it." Maya's weapon trembled in her hands. Behind her, she could hear Sarah speaking urgently into her radio, calling for additional backup and medical assistance. Below them, the sound of children crying echoed through the warehouse as other agents worked to process the victims and secure the scene. "Maya," Sarah said softly, "we need to get him into custody. The children need medical attention, and we need to coordinate with the other locations." But Maya couldn't move. 25 years of questions were finally getting answers, and the truth was somehow worse than anything her imagination had conjured. Her parents hadn't been forced to sell her, they had sought out a buyer. They had actively participated in her destruction, had negotiated the terms of her enslavement as if she were a car they no longer needed. "The truth hurts, doesn't it?" Volkov continued, his voice now gentle, almost therapeutic. "All these years you've been telling yourself that they had no choice, that addiction made them do terrible things to their beloved daughter. But the reality is simpler. They wanted the drugs more than they wanted you." Maya closed her eyes, feeling 25 years of carefully constructed psychological defenses crumbling like walls made of sand. She'd spent her entire identity around the premise that she was a victim who had become a survivor, a broken child who had grown into a protector of other children. But if her parents had actively chosen to destroy her, if they had planned and negotiated and celebrated her sale, then what did that make her? "Maya," Sarah's voice cut through her spiral of self-doubt, "the building is secure, but we've got incoming intelligence about the other locations. We need Volkov alive to coordinate the broader takedown." The reminder of her larger mission pulled her back from the edge of the psychological abyss. Volkov represented more than just her personal trauma. He was the key to dismantling a network that was actively destroying other families, other children who were facing the same betrayal she had experienced. "You're right, Maya," said to Volkov, her voice steady again. "The truth does hurt, but here's another truth. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison, and every child you've ever trafficked is going to testify against you." She holstered her weapon and pulled out her handcuffs. "Marcus Volkov, you're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering, and about 47 other federal charges that are going to keep you locked up until you die." As she snapped the cuffs around Volkov's wrists, Maya felt something shift inside her chest. Not closure exactly, but a sense of completion. The 8-year-old girl who had been sold like property was finally, officially, no longer a victim. "Agent Chen," Thompson's voice came through her earpiece, "we've got intel from Volkov's computer. Looks like he's been keeping detailed records of every transaction for the past 15 years. Names, dates, locations, financial records, everything we need to build cases against his entire network."
Maya looked down at Volkov, who was now sitting in handcuffs with blood from his head wound staining his expensive suit. "Did you keep records of my sale?" Volkov met her eyes with an expression that might have been respect. "I keep records of everything, Agent Chen. Your file was particularly detailed. We wanted to understand how a high-value asset had managed to escape our system." The casual way he referred to her as an asset should have enraged Maya, but instead she felt a strange sense of vindication. She hadn't just escaped, she had become their worst nightmare, a victim who had grown up to hunt her own predators. "Maya," Sarah appeared at her side. "The children are secure and en route to the hospital. Rodriguez found 2 more rooms full of documentation. This operation has been running for decades. We're looking at potentially hundreds of victims." Maya nodded, but her attention was focused on the computer workstation where Thompson was scrolling through files. 25 years of questions were about to be answered. 25 years of nightmares were about to be given names and faces and specific details. "Thompson, I need you to pull my file," she said quietly. "Maya, are you sure? Some information is better left. Pull the file." Thompson's fingers moved across the keyboard with obvious reluctance. After a moment, a document appeared on the screen. A detailed dossier complete with photographs, medical records, and transaction history. Maya stared at her 8-year-old face looking back at her from the monitor, saw the clinical descriptions of her physical condition,
read the notes about her compliance level and market value. But it was the final entry that stopped her cold. Purchase negotiated with biological parents Robert and Linda Chen. Price agreed, $5,000 USD plus 2 grams methamphetamine. Parents expressed relief at transaction completion. Father indicated child was constant reminder of better life they couldn't provide. Mother stated child would be better off with people who could afford to take care of her properly. Maya, Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. You okay? Maya realized she'd been staring at the screen for several minutes while the chaos of the arrest continued around her. Federal agents were cataloging evidence, EMTs were treating the wounded, and somewhere in the building, 14 children were beginning the long process of healing from traumas that would follow them for the rest of their lives. I'm fine, she said, though the words felt like lies in her mouth. I'm exactly where I need to be. She turned away from the computer and looked out the window at the warehouse district spread below them. In the distance, she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles responding to the other trafficking sites they'd identified. Tonight's operation would save dozens of children, would dismantle a network that had operated with impunity for decades, would ensure that Marcus Volkov never again profited from human misery. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of a chapter in a book she wasn't sure she wanted to keep reading. Agent Chen, Deputy Director Wallace's voice crackled through her earpiece. Outstanding work tonight. You've just delivered the biggest trafficking bust in Bureau history. Maya touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling the familiar weight of her mother's photograph inside. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to keep carrying that image or finally let it go. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out who Maya Chen was when she wasn't hunting the man who had destroyed her childhood. But tonight, she was exactly who she needed to be. A federal agent who had brought a monster to justice, a survivor who had become a protector, a broken child who had grown up to a force for healing.
Thank you, sir, she replied into the radio, but the work isn't finished yet. The surveillance van smelled like stale donuts and nervous sweat. Maya adjusted her earpiece for the third time in 10 minutes, watching through the tinted window as the warehouse district settled into its nighttime rhythm. Across the street, Detective Kim was positioned behind a dumpster, her radio silent but her presence a steady comfort in Maya's peripheral vision. 3 other teams were scattered throughout the area, each one a carefully placed piece in a chess game that had taken months to set up. Chen, this is Command. We've got confirmation that the primary target just entered the building. Black Mercedes. License plate matches our intel. Deputy Director Wallace's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained excitement. After 3 years of building this case, everyone could feel the electricity of imminent closure. Maya pressed her earpiece. Copy, Command. How many individuals do we have entering with the primary? 4 bodyguards, plus the driver who stayed with the vehicle. Agent Thompson's position inside confirms approximately 23 individuals currently in the building, including at least 8 minors. 8 children. Maya closed her eyes and saw their faces, not the specific faces of tonight's victims whom she'd never seen, but the composite face of every trafficked child she'd encountered over the past 15 years. They all looked the same in her nightmares, hollow-eyed, silent, carrying an ancient weariness that no child should possess. The warehouse across the street looked innocuous enough in the amber glow of the streetlights, just another converted industrial building in a district full of them. But Maya knew what lay behind those brick walls. A processing center where human beings were cataloged like inventory, where children were prepared for transport to locations across the country, where innocence was appraised and sold to the highest bidder. Agent Chen? It was Thompson's voice, barely above a whisper. We have a problem. They're accelerating the timeline. It looks like they're preparing to move the children tonight, not tomorrow morning as we anticipated. Maya's pulse spiked. The operation plan had been built around a 24-hour window, giving them time to confirm all targets were present and to coordinate with ICE and local social services for victim processing. If Volkov was moving the children early, it meant their intelligence had been compromised, or worse, he suspected they were being watched. Rodriguez, what's your status? Maya spoke into her radio while pulling on her tactical vest. South entrance is clear, but I've got movement around the back loading dock. 2 trucks just pulled up. Looks like they're preparing for transport. Maya's training warred with her instincts. The smart play was to call in additional backup, to wait for optimal positioning, to ensure every angle was covered before making their move. But 25 years of nightmares told her that children were about to disappear into a system designed to erase them completely. She keyed her radio. "All units, this is Agent Chen. We are moving to immediate action. The children are being prepared for transport, and we cannot allow that to happen." "Maya," Sarah's voice cut through the radio chatter, "are you sure about this? We're not in optimal position yet." Maya was out of the van, her service weapon drawn, her focus narrowed to a laser point of determination. "We don't have time for optimal. We have time for right now." The warehouse district at night was a maze of shadows and industrial debris. Maya moved between shipping containers and abandoned equipment, her eyes constantly scanning for threats, while her mind calculated angles and distances. The sound of her own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, punctuated by the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional rumble of freight trains. "Chen, this is Morrison," her supervisor's voice carried a tone of controlled urgency. "Local PD reports suspicious activity in a 3-block radius. We may be dealing with a larger operation than anticipated."
Maya paused behind a concrete barrier, processing the implications. If the warehouse was just one node in a larger network, if Volkov had multiple locations operating simultaneously, then tonight represented more than just a single arrest. It was a chance to dismantle an entire system, to save not just the 8 children inside the warehouse, but potentially dozens of others throughout the city. "Command, I need satellite imagery of the surrounding blocks. If they're running a multi-location operation, I want to know about it." While she waited for the intelligence update, Maya allowed herself to remember the last time she'd been inside a trafficking operation. It had been 18 months ago, an undercover assignment that had taken her deep into a network of truck stops and cheap motels along I-95. She'd posed as a buyer, had forced herself to evaluate children as if they were commodities, had shaken hands with monsters while wearing a wire and praying that her backup was close enough to help if her cover was blown. The hardest part hadn't been the physical danger. She'd been trained for that, had learned to compartmentalize fear and function under pressure. The hardest part had been looking into the eyes of trafficked children and not being able to immediately take them to safety. She'd had to play her role, had to leave them behind while she built a case strong enough to ensure their captors would never hurt anyone again. Some nights, she still wondered if that calculation had been worth it. "Maya, you need to see this." Sarah's voice pulled her back to the present. "I've got a clear line of sight into the building. They're not just preparing the children for transport, they're documenting them. Photos, measurements, some kind of catalog system?" Maya felt ice settle in her stomach. Documentation meant the operation was more sophisticated than they'd anticipated, more organized, and more deeply embedded in a larger network. It also meant the children were being prepared for specific buyers, that their suffering had been pre-ordered by customers who viewed human beings as products to be delivered according to specification. "Command, I need satellite imagery of the surrounding blocks. If they're running a multi-location operation, I want to know about it." "Thompson, what's your visual on the primary target?" "Volkov is in what looks like an office area on the 2nd floor. He's got a laptop open and appears to be conducting some kind of business meeting via video call. I count 3 other individuals with him, all armed." Maya's earpiece crackled with static before Deputy Director Wallace's voice came through clearly. "Chen, satellite confirms multiple vehicles positioned throughout a 6-block radius. We're looking at a coordinated operation involving at least 4 separate locations. This is bigger than we thought." The revelation should have been cause for celebration, a chance to inflict maximum damage on Volkov's network in a single coordinated strike. But Maya felt only a familiar sense of urgency, the weight of every minute that passed while children remained in danger. "Command, I need additional units at locations 2 through 4. We're going to hit all of them simultaneously." "Negative, Chen. We don't have the personnel for a coordinated strike of that magnitude. Local PD is already stretched thin, and our backup teams are 40 minutes out."
Maya closed her eyes, feeling the familiar frustration of operating within a system that moved too slowly to match the urgency of the crimes they were fighting. Bureaucracy and proper procedure were luxuries that trafficked children couldn't afford. "Then we prioritize," she said into the radio. "Location 1, this warehouse, has the highest concentration of victims. We move on that now, and we use the intelligence we gathered to hit the other locations sequentially." "Maya, that's not protocol," Sarah's voice carried a note of warning. "If we tip our hand at location 1, the other sites will scatter. We could lose everyone. And if we wait for perfect conditions, the children at location 1 disappear forever. I'm not willing to make that trade."
She was already moving toward the warehouse, her tactical training taking over as she calculated approach angles and identified potential cover positions. The building loomed ahead of her like a concrete monument to human misery, its windows dark except for the occasional flicker of movement that suggested life inside. "All units, this is Chen. We are go for entry in 60 seconds. Rodriguez, I need you on the south entrance. Sarah, you're with me on the main entry. Thompson, maintain your position and provide intel on target movement." Maya's radio crackled with acknowledgments from her team, each voice steady despite the accelerated timeline. These were professionals who trained for exactly this kind of situation, who understood that sometimes the perfect plan had to give way to immediate action. As she approached the warehouse entrance, Maya felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down, her perception sharpening to superhuman clarity. She could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the industrial chemicals that clung to the building's exterior, could feel the weight of her weapon in her hands like an extension of her own will. Somewhere inside the building, Marcus Volkov was conducting business, making decisions about human lives as if they were entries in a ledger. Somewhere inside, 8 children were waiting to be rescued by people they'd never learned to trust. Maya pressed her back against the warehouse wall, feeling the rough brick through her tactical vest. In 60 seconds, she would step through that door and into a confrontation she'd been preparing for her entire adult life. In 60 seconds, she would face the man who represented everything she'd been running from and everything she'd been chasing. She touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling the familiar comfort of her mother's photo hidden inside. Whatever happened in the next hour, she would carry that image with her, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a promise that this time love would win. The seconds ticked away like heartbeats in the darkness. Maya keyed her radio one final time. "All units, we are go. Remember, children are priority 1. Everything else is secondary." She took a deep breath, tasting rust and desperation and the metallic edge of adrenaline, and stepped toward the door that would lead her home. The warehouse door exploded inward under the force of the breaching charge, sending splinters of wood and metal cascading through the darkness like deadly confetti. Maya was through the opening before the dust settled, her weapon raised, her tactical flashlight cutting through the shadows with surgical precision. "Federal agents, everyone on the ground now." The scene inside the warehouse was worse than her intelligence had suggested. What she'd anticipated as a simple holding facility revealed itself to be a sophisticated operation with multiple levels of organization. Children sat in rows on plastic chairs, the wrists zip-tied, their eyes reflecting her flashlight beam like those of startled animals. Maya counted quickly. Not 8 children as reported, but 14, ranging in age from what looked like 6 years old to mid-teens. "Maya, you need to see this," Thompson's voice crackled through her earpiece. He was standing beside a computer workstation that displayed multiple video feeds. "They're not just running local operations. This is coordinating trafficking routes across the entire eastern seaboard." Maya paused at the bottom of a staircase leading to the second floor, studying the video feeds over Thompson's shoulder. The screens showed warehouses, truck stops, and office buildings across multiple states, a network so vast and sophisticated that her 3 years of investigation had barely scratched the surface. "Command, we need the FBI's full trafficking task force here immediately," Maya spoke into her radio while continuing toward the stairs. "This operation is significantly larger than our intelligence indicated." As she climbed toward the second floor, Maya could hear voices, angry, urgent conversations in multiple languages. Through a partially open door, she could see Marcus Volkov himself, and the sight of him stopped her cold. He was smaller than she'd expected, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked more like an accountant than a monster. His graying hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his overall appearance so utterly ordinary that Maya felt a moment of cognitive dissonance. This was the man who had haunted her nightmares for 25 years? This unremarkable figure who looked like someone's grandfather? "Need to accelerate the entire timeline," Volkov was saying into a phone, his English accented but precise. "The federal investigation is closer than we anticipated. Initiate Protocol 7 at all locations." Maya pressed herself against the wall outside the door, listening as Volkov coordinated what sounded like a complete evacuation of his network. Protocol 7, whatever that meant, was causing urgent activity throughout the building. She could hear vehicles starting outside, footsteps running across the warehouse floor below, and the sound of papers being shredded. "Sir, the transport vehicles are ready, but what about the children? Protocol 7 usually means—" "The children are evidence," Volkov replied coldly. "Evidence cannot be allowed to testify." Maya's blood turned to ice. Protocol 7 wasn't evacuation, it was elimination. Volkov wasn't planning to escape with the children, he was planning to kill them and disappear, leaving behind nothing but bodies and questions. She keyed her radio, whispering urgently, "All units, Protocol 7 means liquidation of witnesses. The children are in immediate danger. Move now." Maya burst through the door, her weapon trained on Volkov's chest. "Federal agent, nobody move!" The room erupted into chaos. 3 armed men who had been standing around Volkov's desk went for their weapons, while Volkov himself dove behind a filing cabinet. Maya's training took over. She put 2 rounds center mass into the closest gunman, rolled behind a desk for return fire that splintered the wood above her head, and came up shooting at the second target. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds, but felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, Maya was standing over Marcus Volkov, her weapon pointed at his head. 25 years of rage and pain crystallized into this single moment of absolute power. "Maya, don't!" Sarah's voice came from the doorway behind her. "He's not worth throwing your career away." Maya stared down at the man who had been the center of her nightmares for most of her adult life. Up close, Volkov looked even more ordinary. Just another middle-aged man in an expensive suit, bleeding from a superficial wound on his forehead, and staring up at her with eyes that showed more annoyance than fear. "Do you remember me?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Volkov studied her face with the cool calculation of someone evaluating a business proposition. "Should I?" 6 months after the warehouse raid, Maya sat in a different kind of room. Smaller, warmer, filled with the soft colors and comfortable furniture that marked it as a space designed for healing rather than interrogation. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves had relocated her practice to a building that specialized in trauma therapy, and Maya had finally stopped deleting the appointment reminder texts. "How are the nightmares?" Dr. Reeves asked, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who had spent decades helping people reassemble their broken pieces. "Different," Maya replied, staring out the window at a playground where children were engaged in the simple joy of being children, swinging, laughing, chasing each other with the kind of carefree abandon that trauma steals. "I used to dream about being 8 years old and helpless. Now I dream about being 33 and powerful, but the children in my dreams are always someone else." The Volkov case had generated 37 federal indictments and led to the rescue of 127 children from trafficking operations across 12 states. The media had dubbed it Operation Homecoming, and Maya had been featured on the cover of FBI Quarterly with the headline, "From Victim to Victor."
She'd thrown the magazine away without reading the article. "Tell me about the children in your dreams," Dr. Reeves prompted. Maya shifted in her chair, still uncomfortable with the vulnerability that therapy required. "They're all the ones we didn't save in time. The ones who were moved before we could reach them, the ones who died before we found them, the ones who are still out there while I'm sitting in comfortable offices talking about my feelings. And do you feel responsible for all of them?" "I feel responsible for the ones I can save. The others—" Maya paused, searching for words to describe the weight she carried. "The others are the reason I can't stop." Dr. Reeves made a note in her file. "Maya, when we first started these sessions, you told me that catching Volkov was the only thing that mattered to you. Now that he's in federal prison awaiting trial, what matters to you?" The question had been haunting Maya for months. Volkov's arrest had created a strange vacuum in her life, an absence of the singular purpose that had driven her for so long. She'd been promoted to senior special agent and given command of the Bureau's new human trafficking task force, but the work felt different now, less personal, more systematic. "I don't know," Maya admitted. "For 3 years, I knew exactly who I was and what I needed to do. Now I feel like I'm floating." "What did you learn about yourself during the investigation?" Maya considered the question. The Volkov case had revealed truths she'd spent 25 years avoiding, had forced her to confront the reality of her parents' choices and her own survival. But it had also shown her something unexpected. She was capable of channeling her pain into purpose, of transforming her trauma into a tool for protecting others. "I learned that I'm stronger than I thought," she said finally, "and more broken than I wanted to admit." Can someone be both strong and broken at the same time? I think that's the only way to be strong. Whole people don't understand what it takes to survive. Broken people do. Through the window, Maya watched a father push his daughter on a swing, both of them laughing at some shared joke. The sight should have triggered her usual spiral of anger and loss, but instead she felt something that might have been peace. Not everyone is her parents. Not every family is built on betrayal. "Dr. Reeves, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think it's possible to forgive people who don't deserve forgiveness?"
Dr. Reeves set down her pen and looked directly at Maya. "I think forgiveness isn't about what other people deserve. It's about what you deserve. The right to stop carrying their choices like stones in your chest." Maya nodded, though the concept still felt foreign. She'd spent so many years using her anger as fuel that the prospect of letting it go felt like disarming herself. But she was tired, bone deep, soul-level tired of carrying 25 years of rage. "The trial starts next month," Maya said, changing the subject. "I'll have to testify about my own trafficking experience, not just the investigation." "How do you feel about that?" "Terrified? Necessary? Ready." Maya smiled slightly. "All three at the same time." The federal courthouse in Baltimore had been transformed into a fortress for United States v. Marcus Volkov and Associates. Security was unprecedented, with U.S. Marshals stationed at every entrance and snipers on nearby rooftops. The case had attracted international attention, not just for its scope, but for the unique element of Maya's testimony, a trafficked child who had grown up to bring down her own traffickers. Maya sat in the witness preparation room, reviewing her notes with Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez, a fierce prosecutor who specialized in human trafficking cases. The two women had worked closely over the past months, building a case so comprehensive that Volkov's defense team had already approached them about a plea deal. "Are you ready for the defense's cross-examination?" Martinez asked. "They're going to try to portray you as emotionally compromised, suggest that your personal involvement has clouded your judgment." Maya had been dreading this aspect of the trial, the inevitable attempt to turn her greatest strength into a weakness, to suggest that her intimate understanding of trafficking somehow made her testimony less reliable rather than more powerful. "Let them try," Maya replied.
Emotion doesn't invalidate evidence. If anything, it validates it. The courtroom was packed with media, law enforcement, and advocates from anti-trafficking organizations. Maya sat in the witness stand wearing her dress blue FBI uniform, her badge and service awards visible reminders of the authority she'd earned through decades of dedicated service. Agent Chen, prosecutor Martinez began, please tell the court about your professional background. Maya spoke clearly and confidently about her 15 years with the FBI, her specialized training in human trafficking investigation, her role in developing new protocols for victim recovery. She outlined her credentials with the same precision she'd use in any professional setting, establishing her expertise before revealing her personal connection to the case. Now, Agent Chen, I need to ask you about events from 25 years ago. Can you tell the court what happened to you when you were 8 years old? The courtroom fell silent. Maya looked directly at the jury, 12 men and women who would decide Volkov's fate, and began to speak. When I was 8 years old, my parents sold me to human traffickers for $5,000 and a bag of methamphetamine. The simple statement carried the weight of 25 years of pain, but Maya's voice remained steady. She told her story without flinching. The negotiation between her parents and Volkov's representatives, the 3 years of captivity that followed, her eventual escape and recovery. And, Agent Chen, the man who orchestrated your trafficking, is he in this courtroom today? Maya looked directly at Marcus Volkov, who sat at the defense table wearing an expensive suit and an expression of complete indifference. Yes, the defendant, Marcus Volkov.
The defense attorney's cross-examination was as brutal as expected. He questioned Maya's memory of events from decades ago, suggested that her personal involvement had compromised her objectivity, implied that her entire career had been built around an obsession with revenge rather than justice. Agent Chen, the defense attorney said, isn't it true that you've spent your entire adult life hunting my client? That this case represents a personal vendetta rather than legitimate law enforcement? Maya met his gaze calmly. Counselor, I've spent my adult life hunting people who traffic children. Your client happens to be one of the most prolific traffickers in American history. If that makes this personal, then I'm proud of how personal it is. But surely you can see how your emotional investment in this case might affect your judgment? My emotional investment in this case is exactly what makes my judgment sound, Maya replied. I know what trafficking looks like because I've lived it. I know how these networks operate because I've studied them from the inside. I know the long-term damage they cause because I've spent 25 years healing from it. The defense attorney pressed harder, trying to find cracks in Maya's composure, weaknesses in her testimony, anything that might cast doubt on her credibility. But Maya had been preparing for this moment her entire adult life, and her answers were unshakable. Agent Chen, you claim to have healed from your trafficking experience, but isn't it true that you've never married, never had children, never maintained long-term relationships? Doesn't that suggest that you're still damaged by what happened to you? Maya felt a flash of anger at the personal nature of the attack, but her response was measured. Counselor, healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending that trauma doesn't leave scars. It means choosing to use those scars to protect other people from the same damage. So you admit that you're scarred? I admit that I'm human, and I submit that my scars make me better at my job, not worse. The jury seemed convinced. After 3 days of testimony from Maya and dozens of other witnesses, other victims, federal agents, forensic accountants who had traced Volkov's financial network, the case went to deliberation. Maya waited in the courthouse cafeteria, surrounded by her team but feeling utterly alone. Sarah sat beside her, offering quiet support without trying to fill the silence with meaningless reassurance. Whatever happens, you did the right thing, Sarah said. You saved those children, and you made sure Volkov can never hurt anyone else. Maya nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere.
In the past 6 months, she'd watched 14 children begin the long process of recovery, some returning to families, others entering foster care, all of them carrying scars that would take years to heal. She had attended therapy sessions and medical appointments, had seen the slow progress of trauma victims learning to trust the world again. The work wasn't glamorous. There were no dramatic moments of revelation, no instant transformation from victim to survivor. Healing was incremental, uncertain, marked with setbacks and small victories that barely registered in the media coverage of the case. But it was real work, important work, and Maya had discovered that she was good at it. "Maya, what do you want to do with the rest of your life?" Dr. Reeves had said during their last session. For the first time in years, Maya had an answer that didn't involve hunting Marcus Volkov. The jury returned after 18 hours of deliberation. Maya stood as the foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears. Maya felt Sarah's hand squeeze her shoulder, felt the satisfaction of justice delivered, and felt the weight of 25 years of questions finally resolved.
But most of all, she felt ready to begin the next chapter of her life. 3 years later, the Maya Chen Institute for Trafficking Survivors occupied a converted mansion in suburban Baltimore, its grand staircases and high-ceilinged rooms now filled with the sounds of healing rather than the echoes of old money. Maya walked through the building's main corridor, checking on the various programs that had grown organically from the simple idea that survivors could help other survivors in ways that traditional therapy couldn't quite reach. In the art therapy room, 15-year-old Jessica was working on a sculpture, twisted metal that somehow conveyed both destruction and hope. Jessica had been rescued from a trafficking ring in Miami 8 months ago, and she'd barely spoken for the first 6 weeks of her recovery. Now she was creating art that would be featured in an exhibition designed to raise awareness about human trafficking. "Miss Maya," Jessica called out, using the informal title that all the residents had adopted, "can you look at this?" Maya approached the sculpture, recognizing in its tortured forms the same struggles she'd faced 25 years ago, the challenge of rebuilding an identity from the fragments of a shattered childhood. "It's powerful, Jess. What does it represent to you?" "It's what I used to be," Jessica replied, gesturing to the twisted base of the sculpture. "And this part up here, this is what I'm becoming." The upper portion of the sculpture was still rough, unfinished, but it reached toward the ceiling with unmistakable determination. Maya saw in it the same qualities she recognized in all her residents, the stubborn refusal to be defined by what had been done to them. "It's beautiful," Maya said, and meant it. The Institute housed 24 survivors at any given time, ranging in age from 12 to 19. Some stayed for months, others for years, all of them working through the complex process of reclaiming their lives from people who had treated them as commodities. Maya had designed the program based on her own experience, the things that had helped her heal, the support she needed but hadn't always received. "Maya," called Dr. Sandra Williams, the Institute's chief psychologist, "we've got the quarterly review meeting in 10 minutes. Maya nodded and made her way to the conference room, passing walls lined with artwork, photographs, and letters from former residents who had moved on to college, jobs, families, and futures that trafficking had tried to steal from them. The letters were Maya's favorite feature of the building, tangible proof that healing was possible, that survival could transform into thriving. The quarterly review brought together the Institute's staff, psychologists, social workers, teachers, and former trafficking survivors who now worked as counselors and advocates. Maya had insisted on hiring survivors for key positions, believing that lived experience was as valuable as academic credentials when it came to understanding trauma and recovery. "Update on our success metrics," Dr. Williams began, consulting her notes. "We've had a 93% success rate in preventing re-trafficking among our residents. 87% have completed their GED or high school diploma programs. 64% have enrolled in college or vocational training." The numbers were impressive, but Maya knew they represented something more important than statistics,
They represented young people who had reclaimed their right to make choices about their own lives. What about the new federal funding proposal? Asked Maria Santos, the Institute's director of victim services and herself a trafficking survivor who had overcome her experiences to earn a master's degree in social work.
The Senate subcommittee approved it last week, Maya replied. We'll have funding for 3 additional facilities, one in Los Angeles, one in Miami, and one in Chicago. We're looking at serving over 200 survivors annually by next year. The expansion represented a dream Maya had been nurturing since the Institute's founding. No single facility could address the scope of the trafficking problem, but a network of survivor-led programs could begin to make a systemic difference. Maya, Dr. Williams said, there's something else we need to discuss. The documentary crew from 60 Minutes wants to schedule the final interview next week. Maya nodded reluctantly. The media attention had been both blessing and curse. It brought funding and awareness, but it also meant repeatedly reliving her own trauma for public consumption. She'd learned to manage the spotlight, to use her story as a tool for education rather than exploitation, but it never got easier. Schedule it for Friday afternoon, she said. I want the focus to be on the residents and the program, not on my personal story. After the meeting, Maya retreated to her office, a space she designed to feel more like a living room than a traditional workplace. The walls were covered with photos of Institute graduates, artwork created by residents, and letters from law enforcement agencies that had adopted the Institute's protocols for victim recovery. On her desk sat a framed photo that she'd found among Volkov's files after his conviction, the original documentation of her own sale, now transformed from evidence of her victimization into a reminder of how far she'd traveled. Beside it was a more recent photo, Maya standing with the 14 children who had been rescued from Volkov's warehouse, taken 6 months after their rescue when they'd all gathered for a reunion. Most of the children were doing well. Some had returned to families, others had entered foster care. 2 had come to live at the Institute when their families couldn't provide the specialized care they needed. All of them carried scars, but all of them were healing. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, who had left the FBI to become the Institute's Director of Security and Investigations. CNN interview went well. They want to do a follow-up piece about the expansion. Maya smiled. Sarah had become more than a partner. She'd become a sister, a co-conspirator in the work of healing, someone who understood that justice was about more than arrests and convictions. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Jennifer Martinez, the prosecutor who had secured Volkov's conviction, entered with a stack of legal files and a familiar expression of professional satisfaction mixed with personal concern. I have news, Jennifer said, settling into the chair across from Maya's desk. Volkov's appeal was denied. The conviction stands, and he's been transferred to ADX Florence. Maximum security, solitary confinement, no chance of parole. Maya felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction, closure, and something that might have been sadness. Volkov would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, his empire dismantled, his ability to harm others permanently ended. It was justice, but it was also the end of a chapter in Maya's life that had defined her for so long. How do you feel about it? Jennifer asked. Relieved, Maya said after a moment, and ready to move on. It was true. For the first time in 25 years, Maya could think about Marcus Volkov without feeling the familiar surge of rage and determination. He was no longer a target to be hunted. He was simply a broken man in a cage, paying the price for decades of unspeakable crimes. There's something else, Jennifer continued. The Justice Department wants to use your institute's model as the template for a national victim recovery program. They're proposing legislation that would fund similar facilities in every state.
Maya leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. A national network of survivor-led recovery programs could transform how the country approached human trafficking, shifting the focus from purely punitive measures to comprehensive healing and prevention. What would that mean for the Institute?
It would mean you've succeeded beyond your wildest dreams, Jennifer replied. Your story, from victim to survivor to protector, would become the model for how we help other survivors rebuild their lives. That evening, Maya walked through the Institute's grounds as residents prepared for dinner. In the dining room, she could hear conversations in multiple languages: English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, the voices of young people from around the world who had found safety in this place she'd built from her own experience of suffering and recovery. 5 years later, the National Trafficking Survivors Network had grown to include 47 facilities across the United States, serving over 1,500 survivors annually. Maya stood before a Senate subcommittee, delivering her annual report on the program's effectiveness. Senators, the data is clear. Survivor-led recovery programs are not just more effective than traditional approaches, they're transformational. When trafficking victims are helped by people who have walked the same path, who understand the trauma from the inside, they heal faster and more completely. Senator Patricia Walsh, the subcommittee chair, leaned forward. Dr. Chen. Maya had completed her doctorate in psychology 2 years earlier, writing her dissertation on trauma recovery among trafficking survivors. What do you see as the next phase of this work? Maya considered the question. In the past 8 years, she'd watched the field of anti-trafficking work evolve from a law enforcement focus to a comprehensive approach that included prevention, intervention, and long-term recovery. But there was still work to be done. Prevention, Senator. We need to address the root causes that make children vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. Poverty, family dysfunction, lack of education, social isolation. These are the conditions that traffickers exploit. And how do we address those root causes? The same way we've addressed recovery, by listening to the people who have lived the experience. Former trafficking victims don't just understand how to heal from trafficking, they understand how trafficking happens in the first place. After the hearing, Maya drove through the Washington, D.C. streets where she'd once worked as a federal agent. The FBI building where she'd spent 15 years of her life looked smaller somehow, less imposing than it had when her entire identity was tied to her badge and her weapon. She pulled into the parking lot of the D.C. Survivors Institute, the network's flagship facility. Inside, she found the familiar controlled chaos of an organization dedicated to healing. Therapy sessions, educational classes, art workshops, and the constant buzz of young people working to reclaim their futures. "Maya!" called out Alex Rivera, a 19-year-old who had been trafficked from Guatemala at age 14 and had recently completed his GED. "I got the letter from Georgetown! I got in!" Maya hugged him, feeling the familiar joy that came with watching survivors achieve milestones that trafficking had tried to make impossible. Alex wanted to study international relations, with plans to work on anti-trafficking policy. He was part of a growing movement of survivors who were transforming their trauma into expertise, their pain into purpose. "I'm proud of you," Maya said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. 10 years later, Maya stood in the same warehouse district where she'd arrested Marcus Volkov, but the landscape had been transformed. Where once there had been abandoned buildings and empty lots, now there was a thriving community center, affordable housing, and the headquarters of the Maya Chen Foundation, an organization that had grown beyond her wildest imagination.
The foundation now operated programs in 12 countries, working with local organizations to develop culturally appropriate approaches to trafficking prevention and survivor recovery. Maya had traveled to Cambodia, India, Nigeria, and Moldova, learning from local activists and sharing the lessons of her own journey. But today, she was here for a different reason. Today was the dedication of the Memorial Garden, a space designed to honor the victims of human trafficking who hadn't survived to see freedom. The garden was simple, a series of curved pathways surrounded by flowering trees, with a central fountain that reflected the sky. At the heart of the space was a wall bearing thousands of names, some known, others represented by simple markers reading "Unknown Child" or "Anonymous Survivor." Maya found the section she was looking for and placed a small bouquet of white roses beneath two names, Robert Chen and Linda Chen. Her parents had died 7 years earlier, her father from an overdose, her mother from liver failure, both of them having never overcome the addictions that had led them to sell their daughter.
Maya had learned of their deaths through a social worker who had been trying to locate family members for estate purposes. They had died in poverty, alone, carrying whatever guilt and regret they'd felt about their choices. Maya had paid for their funerals and arranged for them to be buried side by side, their headstones bearing a simple inscription, "Beloved Parents of Maya Chen." The forgiveness had taken years to achieve and still felt fragile, but it was real. Maya had come to understand that her parents were victims too, of addiction, of poverty, of a system that had failed to provide them with the support they needed to protect their child. Their choices had been inexcusable, but they had also been human. Maya. Sarah approached, accompanied by her wife and their 2 adopted daughters, sisters who had been rescued from trafficking 5 years earlier and who now called Sarah and her wife Mom. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked. Maya looked around the garden, at the families who had gathered to remember loved ones, at the survivors who had come to honor their own journeys, at the activists and advocates who continued the work of breaking chains and building hope. "Grateful," Maya said simply. That evening, as the memorial service concluded and the crowds dispersed, Maya remained in the garden. She sat on a bench beside the fountain, listening to the sound of water and watching the light fade from purple to black across the Baltimore sky. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Reeves, now in her 70s but still practicing. "Saw the news coverage of the memorial. How are you doing?" Maya typed back, "I'm exactly where I need to be." It was true. The 8-year-old girl who had been sold by her parents had grown into a woman who had saved hundreds of other children. The victim had become a victor, but more importantly, she had become a bridge, someone who could help other survivors cross from trauma to healing, from broken to whole, from victim to protector. As Maya sat in the memorial garden, surrounded by the names of those who hadn't survived and the presence of those who had, she felt something she had rarely experienced in her 43 years of life. Peace. The work would continue. There would always be children who needed protection, survivors who needed healing, systems that needed reform. But the work was no longer hers alone. It belonged to a community of survivors and advocates who had learned that the most powerful force against human trafficking wasn't law enforcement or legislation, though both were important. The most powerful force was love. The decision to choose healing over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair.
Maya touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling the familiar weight of her mother's photograph. But now the image carried a different meaning. Not a reminder of betrayal, but a symbol of the complex reality that people could be both broken and beloved, damaged and deserving of compassion. She stood and walked toward the garden's exit, past the flowering trees and the carved names, and the fountain that reflected stars. Tomorrow she would return to the work of healing, her own and others. Tomorrow she would continue building a world where no child would be sold, where no survivor would be forgotten, where every person would be valued for their humanity rather than their utility. But tonight she was simply Maya Chen, survivor, protector, bridge between darkness and light, living proof that love could triumph over the worst that humans could do to each other. The last entry in Marcus Volkov's trafficking database, discovered years after his conviction, had been about her. Subject 247A, Maya Chen. High-value asset with unusual resistance to psychological conditioning. Recommend permanent containment protocols. Volkov had been wrong about everything that mattered. Maya hadn't been contained, she had been liberated. Her resistance hadn't been unusual, it had been inevitable. And her value couldn't be measured in dollars because her worth was infinite, immeasurable, sacred. 15 years later, the auditorium at Johns Hopkins University was packed with an audience that spanned generations. College students studying social work and criminology, veteran law enforcement officers, policymakers, survivors, and families of survivors. Maya stood at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected every stage of the journey she had traveled. At 58, Maya carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into societal change. Her hair was silver now, and laugh lines had joined the scars around her eyes, evidence of a life that had learned to embrace joy alongside sorrow, hope alongside memory. "When I was 8 years old," she began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, "I learned that love and betrayal could exist in the same moment, that parents could choose addiction over their children, and that some adults viewed children as commodities to be bought and sold." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Maya's story had become legendary in anti-trafficking circles, but she rarely told it in its entirety anymore. Today was different. Today marked the 20th anniversary of Volkov's arrest and the launch of the Global Survivors Initiative, a program that would extend the work she'd started to every continent. "I also learned," Maya continued, "that survival was possible, that healing was a choice you made every day, and that the most powerful response to evil was not revenge, but rescue." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, a photograph of the original Maya Chen Institute, now one of over 200 facilities worldwide. 20 years ago, we rescued 14 children from a trafficking operation. Today, those children are adults, teachers, social workers, artists, parents, advocates. They are doctors and mechanics and musicians and farmers. They are proof that trafficking doesn't define who you become, it's simply something that happened to you. Maya advanced to the next slide, showing a world map dotted with red pins representing survivor-led programs. The Global Survivors Initiative represents the culmination of 30 years of learning from survivors themselves. We now know that the most effective anti-trafficking work isn't done by people with degrees in psychology or law enforcement, though both are important. It's done by people with degrees in survival. A hand shot up in the audience. "Dr. Chen, what would you say to someone who's currently trapped in a trafficking situation?" Maya paused, remembering the countless times she'd been asked this question, the weight of speaking to invisible audiences who might be listening in desperation. "I would say, you are not alone. Your situation is not your fault. You are worth saving, worth fighting for, worth the effort it will take to heal. And I would say, hold on, help is coming. We are coming." She clicked to a new slide, a photo of her most recent project, a residential facility for elderly trafficking survivors who had aged out of other support systems. Recovery doesn't have an expiration date. Healing doesn't have an age limit. Hope doesn't have a deadline. 25 years later. The Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony took place on a crisp October morning in the Rose Garden. Maya stood among a dozen other recipients, scientists, artists, activists, and public servants who had dedicated their lives to making the world better. At 63, she moved more slowly than she once had, her body bearing the accumulated weight of decades spent fighting for justice. President Rodriguez, herself the daughter of immigrants who had overcome tremendous obstacles, placed the medal around Maya's neck and whispered, "Thank you for showing us that victims can become victors, and that the most powerful force for change is lived experience." Maya touched the medal, heavy, warm, inscribed with words about freedom and dignity, and thought about the 8-year-old girl who had been sold for $5,000 and a bag of drugs. That child could never have imagined this moment, could never have dreamed that her suffering would become the foundation for a movement that had saved thousands of lives. In the audience, she could see familiar faces. Sarah and her family, Dr. Reeves, now in her 90s, but still sharp as ever, Jennifer Martinez, now a federal judge, and dozens of survivors who had become advocates, educators, and leaders in their own right.
But the faces that mattered most to Maya were the ones that weren't there. The children who were currently living in safety because of the systems she'd helped build. The future generations who would grow up in a world slightly less tolerant of exploitation. The survivors who would never have to wonder if healing was possible because they could see the proof all around them. 30 years later. The Maya Chen Center for Global Human Rights occupied a full city block in downtown Baltimore. Its modern glass and steel architecture designed to inspire hope rather than impose authority. Maya, now 73, walked slowly through the building's memorial hall, her steps echoing in the vast space lined with photographs of survivors from around the world. She paused before a display case containing artifacts from her own journey. The silver locket her mother had given her, now opened to reveal 2 photos, the original faded image of her parents, and a new photo of herself with some of the thousands of survivors she'd helped over the decades. "Grandma Maya?" a small voice called out. Maya turned to see Elena, the 6-year-old daughter of one of her former residents, running toward her with the boundless energy of a child who had never known fear. Elena's mother, Carmen, had been trafficked from Honduras at age 12 and had lived at the Institute for 3 years before earning her nursing degree and starting a family. "Hi, sweetheart," Maya said, lifting Elena into her arms despite the protest from her aging back. "Are you here for the ceremony?" Elena nodded enthusiastically. Today marked the official opening of the center's new wing, a research facility dedicated to developing innovative approaches to trafficking prevention. The ceremony would be attended by diplomats, activists, and survivors from around the world. But Maya's favorite guests would be the children and grandchildren of former residents, living proof that healing was possible and hope was hereditary. "Grandma Maya," Elena said seriously, "Mama says you saved her when she was little. Did you really?" Maya considered the question. She'd been called a hero countless times over the years, had received awards and recognition from organizations around the world. But the truth was more complex than any heroic narrative could capture. "Your mama saved herself," Maya said finally. "I just helped her remember that she was worth saving."
The ceremony that afternoon was attended by over 1,000 people, including 5 presidents, dozens of Nobel laureates, and representatives from every major human rights organization in the world. Maya stood at the podium one last time, looking out at an audience that included some of the most powerful people on Earth and some of the most vulnerable. 55 years ago, she began, I was an 8-year-old girl who learned that some adults would choose money over love, drugs over their own children, temporary relief over permanent responsibility. I learned that evil was real, that suffering was possible, and that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you would be the ones who destroyed you instead. The audience was absolutely silent, even the children sensing the gravity of the moment. But I also learned, Maya continued, her voice growing stronger, that survival was possible, that healing was a choice, and that the most powerful response to betrayal was not revenge, it was rescue. Not just rescuing others, but rescuing ourselves from the hatred that trauma tries to plant in our hearts. She gestured to the audience, to the faces of survivors and allies and advocates who had joined the fight against human trafficking. Everyone in this room is proof that love is stronger than evil, that hope is more powerful than despair, and that the human spirit cannot be bought, sold, or permanently broken. We are proof that victims can become protectors, that the wounded can become healers, and that those who have been cast aside by society can become its greatest champions. Maya paused, feeling the weight of 30 years of advocacy, of countless nights spent comforting traumatized children, of endless battles with bureaucrats and politicians, and anyone who thought that some people mattered less than others. The work is not finished, she said. It may never be finished, but it is no longer mine alone. It belongs to all of you, survivors and allies,
advocates and educators, parents and children and grandchildren who refuse to accept a world where human beings are treated as property. She looked directly at Elena, who was sitting in the front row with her mother, both of them representing the future that Maya had spent her life fighting to create. To every child who is currently trapped in a situation that seems hopeless, to every survivor who wonders if healing is possible, to every person who has ever felt worthless or forgotten or discarded, you are not alone. You are loved. You are valuable. You are worth fighting for, and we will never stop fighting for you. Maya stepped away from the podium as the audience arose in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. But she wasn't thinking about the applause or the recognition or the legacy she was leaving behind. She was thinking about tomorrow, when the real work would continue, the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of healing one person at a time, of building a world where no child would ever be sold, where no survivor would ever be forgotten, where love would always triumph over the forces that sought to destroy it. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds dispersed, Maya found herself alone in the memorial hall, surrounded by the faces of thousands of survivors whose lives had intersected with hers over the decades. Some had gone on to become doctors and teachers and artists. Others had struggled with addiction and mental illness and the lingering effects of trauma. All of them had been worthy of love, worthy of rescue, worthy of the chance to choose their own futures. Maya touched the silver locket at her throat one final time, feeling the familiar weight of memory and love and loss. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, toward the parking lot where Carmen and Elena were waiting to drive her home, toward whatever tomorrow would bring. Behind her, engraved in marble above the memorial hall's entrance, were the words that had guided her entire adult life. In memory of those we couldn't save. In honor of those we could. In service to those we haven't met yet. The work would continue. The healing would continue. The hope would continue.
And somewhere in Baltimore, in a small apartment overlooking the harbor, an 8-year-old girl was sleeping safely in her own bed, protected by parents who would never choose anything over her safety, dreaming dreams that no one would ever try to steal from her. That was Maya's true legacy, not the medals or the recognition or the buildings that bore her name, but the children who slept safely because of the world she had helped create, the survivors who healed because of the programs she had built, the future generations who would grow up in a world slightly more committed to protecting the vulnerable and slightly less tolerant of those who would exploit them. Me? It's personal. That's exactly the problem, Morrison stood, leaving his empty coffee cup on her desk. Maya, you're one of the best agents I've ever worked with. Your clearance rate is unprecedented. Your undercover work is brilliant, and your dedication is unquestionable. But you're also human, and humans have limits. Maya turned back to her computer screen, dismissing him with body language. I'll rest when Volkov is behind bars. You'll rest when I order you to rest, Morrison replied, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years supervising federal agents. You've got 48 hours to close this operation. After that, you're on mandatory leave pending full psychological evaluation. The ultimatum hung in the air between them like smoke. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but a crystalline clarity that cut through months of exhaustion and uncertainty. 48 hours. She could work with that. After Morrison left, Maya pulled up the surveillance footage from the warehouse they'd been monitoring. For 3 months, she'd watched the patterns, memorized the schedules, identified every player in Volkov's organization. She knew which guards favored their left hands when they drew weapons, knew which door hinges squeaked,
knew the exact route the delivery trucks took when they brought new victims to the compound. Her phone rang. Detective Kim, calling from her own desk across the office. "Maya, I just heard about Morrison's deadline. How are you holding up?" Maya watched Sarah through the maze of cubicles, noted the concern etched in her partner's young face. "I'm fine. We knew this day was coming." "Are you, though? Fine, I mean? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like someone who hasn't slept in a week and hasn't eaten a real meal in longer than that." Maya glanced down at her desk, noted the empty energy drink cans and protein bar wrappers that had accumulated over the past few days. When had she last eaten something that required a fork? When had she last tasted food rather than simply consuming fuel? "I eat," she said weakly. "Caffeine and sugar don't count as food groups." Sarah appeared at her cubicle, phone still pressed to her ear even though they were now face to face. "Maya, when's the last time you did something that wasn't related to this case? When's the last time you watched a movie, went on a date, called a friend?" The questions felt like accusations, highlighting the emptiness that surrounded Maya's singular focus. She tried to remember the last time she had laughed at something that wasn't gallows humor shared with fellow law enforcement. She tried to recall the conversation she'd had that wasn't about trafficking routes or surveillance patterns or arrest warrants. The effort was exhausting. "I don't have friends," Maya said simply. "I have colleagues and victims and suspects. That's enough."
It's not enough, and you know it. Sarah sat on the edge of Maya's desk, her expression serious. "I've read your file, Maya, all of it. I know what happened to you, and I know why this case matters so much. But I also know that you're not the same person who was sold when you were 8 years old. You're not responsible for saving every victim just because you couldn't save yourself." The words hit Maya like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at the guilt she carried like armor. She'd spent 25 years believing that her survival came with an obligation, that her escape from hell meant she owed a debt to everyone still trapped there. The logic had sustained her through college, through the police academy, through years of undercover work that would have broken someone with less invested in the outcome. "You don't understand," Maya said quietly. "Every day we don't catch him, more children disappear. Every hour we waste on psychological evaluations and mandatory leave, someone else's 8-year-old is being sold by their parents. And you think you're the only one who can save them? I think I'm the only one who knows what it feels like to be them." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Maya's face with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "What happens after, Maya? What happens when Volkov is arrested and the case is closed? What's left?" The question sent a chill through Maya's chest. She had spent so many years focused on this singular goal that she had never allowed herself to imagine beyond it. What would her life look like without the consuming purpose of hunting the man who had destroyed her childhood? What would she be without her pain and her mission and her badge? "I don't know," she admitted, the honesty feeling like a vulnerability she couldn't afford. "Maybe that's something worth figuring out before we go in there tonight." Maya looked around her cubicle, at the maps and photographs and red string that had become her world, at the coffee-stained files and energy drink cans and computer screens that never slept. This wasn't a life, she realized. It was an existence, a holding pattern disguised as purpose. But it was all she knew how to be. Maya Chen had been sold for $5,000 and a bag of drugs, but she had become priceless, not because of what she had overcome, but because of what she had chosen to do with her survival. The 8-year-old victim had become the 73-year-old victor, but more importantly, she had become a bridge, a light in the darkness, a voice for the voiceless, and proof that love could triumph over the worst that humans could do to each other. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.